In addition, there's also dust inhalation. When you crack concrete and you break it apart, it becomes this very fine dust. So the earthquake busts these things apart. There's a lot of dust out there. That dust from concrete actually was small enough to be able to fly up into the air and then breathe it down into your lungs. And there's several different examples where that causes an irritation in the lungs. It kind of irritates and burns the lungs and can create a pneumonia. It can also line the lungs themselves and actually reset. So you have this dry cement in a breath, pull it into your lungs where it's wet, and then it's reconstituted, so to speak, and actually then lines the lung itself and creates these concretions, or these actual thick things that actually form inside the lung itself. So we have to be very careful when we're talking about smoke and dust inhalation, personal protective equipment, respiratory protection, other kinds of measures that we can take for the responders, but also keeping in mind as well that many of our potential disaster victims in an earthquake can also have these kinds of symptoms as well of smoke and dust inhalation. So we really have to think in terms of being able to look at their respiratory health when we're trying to treat those. And also as well, those survivors that are still in that area have to think in terms of protecting themselves against this dust and this potential smoke exposure. So there are other delayed health effects as well that involve worsening of existing chronic disease. And I've alluded to this in the past as well, but let's go through this again because it certainly bears some attention here. You know, many people around the world, especially older populations, have heart disease, they have lung disease, diabetes, high blood pressure. Many populations may have mental illness in individuals and so on. And those become worsened as a result of just about any type of disaster, and especially when we're talking about severe disasters like earthquakes. So once again, the stress that people go through, the challenges and the respiratory exposures can worsen lung disease, diabetes. People lose their insulin, they change their diets, they also are changing their activity levels and so on. That diabetes can worsen. High blood pressure because of the stress hormones and other changes, they may not be able to stay on their medications, have that as well. People that have mental illness, it's relatively controlled by medication or by counseling and psychological interventions. Something happens in their life as destructive and as remarkable as an earthquake, that mental illness can pop up and also become an exacerbation as well. So have to think in terms of these chronic diseases, especially when we're talking about high resource nations where people have more of these types of diseases to begin with. Let's look a little bit more at earthquake-related mortality because I want to, go back to that same idea I talked about of earthquakes don't kill people, buildings kill people. Nearly 75% of earthquake-related deaths are caused by structural collapse. It's the collapse of the building where you are. And also, of course, sometimes people may run outside the building, but that also the facades from buildings and other structures can also fall on them as well. So we have to think in terms of these structures, the safety of these structures. Is the school safe? Are we building schools safe to meet the codes? Are we building hospitals so that they survive these earthquakes? And people say, wow, that could be so much more expensive if we have to build the hospital to where it actually can be survived in an earthquake. But actually, you know what? That's not true. Some of these studies show that about 4 to 6% increase in the cost of a hospital to be able to make it earthquake proof when you're building the hospital itself. So thinking in terms of that cost effectiveness, is it worth 4, 5%, 6% more to be able to have a hospital that you can rely upon even through these times of dire need? Certainly it is, of course. And so we have to think in terms of structural collapse of being a big issue. And once again, it causes this trauma, it causes the crush syndrome that I've mentioned as well. Thinking in terms of structural collapse and how can we maintain those structures, not only in buildings, but also in highways, over ramps, the kinds of overpasses and things like that that we want to be able to sustain through the earthquake so that we can then pass and have communication and transportation still viable so that rescue crews can get through there so that you can evacuate the area if you need to. And so we think in terms of structural integrity when we're talking about earthquakes. Think of earthquakes, think of building things to save and to live through them. And then this other aspect as well, urban fires, major reason for deaths following earthquakes as well. And these fires can become very large because they pass from one building to another. An entire downtown area can be engulfed in a firestorm if we're not thinking in terms of ability to be able to regulate and control the gas that comes into these areas, accessibility and being able to have fire suppression and so on, and other measures for urban fire fighting, prevention, and control as well. So it's another aspect of that urban earthquake-related mortality. So let's compare this earthquake-related health effects to other natural disasters. And so I want to kind of put it into place of ranking for a couple of these different disasters. For example, let's rank earthquake-related health effects compared to other natural disasters. For example, earthquakes overall over the past 50 years were about third place for the number of deaths per event. They're also third place for the mortality rate. In other words, the number of deaths per 100,000 people affected. And also for the displacement rate, the number of people displaced per 100,000 people affected. And then fourth place for the injury rate itself. And this issue of public health consequences of earthquakes, before I promised you, for each one of these disasters as we're going through this particular seminar, we're going to talk about the public health consequences for each one of these. And so you'll see this particular figure over and over again for each one of the hazards that we've discussed in natural disasters. And you recognize this gray or white column on the far left. These are the public health consequences that happen in all disasters. And the coloring for this particular table, red, amber, and green, are the three different colors that I use to describe the severity for each one of these. So we can kind of get a color-coded image of what is the big problem and what are the small problems. All of them, of course, problems, but what are the real priorities when we're talking about these kinds of things? And you can see here in this particular table, number of deaths and number of injuries are in red. They're very high for earthquakes, and we have to recognize that and think in terms of how can we be able to make a difference in that. When we have a high number of deaths in any event, we have to start thinking in terms of preventing people from ever even being injured, because high number of deaths, especially in the immediate phase, means no one has a chance to get to you during that time. You're completely on your own, so we have to take those kinds of steps ahead of time. Prevent, protect, prepare. That's what I'm here for. That's what I'm living for. It's to really get people to think in terms of that. And then the other aspect that we can see in red for this particular table is public concern for safety, right? I mean, an earthquake has just happened. You've just seen your city or your country brought to its knees by this particular event. And a lot of people are scared. A lot of people want to know how to protect themselves, how to protect their families, what to do. They may have not have given it good thought like they should be ahead of time to be able to think in terms of that. And so those are the three that are really the big ones. And then the rest of them, the orange that we have in here, the amber, a lot of those are a result of the damages that occur in the buildings. And so this loss or damage of the healthcare system itself is basically because the clinics and the hospitals themselves are damaged. They may not have functionally collapsed, they may not have the buildings actually fall, but a hospital, for example, may lose water. Its water mains may be broken, or its electricity or generator capabilities may be damaged in that hospital. And when that happens, that's when you really end up losing the hospital functionality. So we call that functional failure in a particular hospital or a particular clinic. We also see, of course, this worsening of chronic illnesses, and then we see this other sort of cascade of events that I point out as one of those key clusters that occur with disasters, that loss of shelter. Remember, in some of my early presentations in this series, we talked about that loss of shelter phenomenon. If you lose your shelter, you lose your water, you lose your food security or your ability to prepare food, you lose your toilets, you lose your sanitation, ability to wash your hands and take care of yourself in a healthy way. And so therefore, we see this cluster as well. So we see the loss of shelter, sanitation, water, all affected when we're talking about earthquakes. And that's what causes this rapid onset and then these delayed impacts as well. So you can see earthquakes, very severe phenomenon. And I want to start with one of these, dispel one of these earthquake myths as well. And this is one of those things you'll hear me say, don't get me started. Earthquakes and epidemics. People, after nearly every earthquake that happens around the world, doesn't make a difference to the society. People say, oh, well, an earthquake happened, we're going to have epidemics. Not true. Not true. Actually, epidemics are extremely, extremely rare in any seismic event. Earthquake, landslide, tsunami, anything geological, you just don't see it. Now, of course, you see outbreaks occur with some certain disasters, but for the most part, for most disasters, this doesn't happen. But this is a very common myth, and many times the press will jump right on this, doing the best they can, of course, all best intentions, but it's just misinformed. And then even some societies as well will spend a lot of resources during the earthquake when people still don't have food and shelter and water, the three things they need the most. People go out and start trying to stop the epidemic from occurring. And some societies I've even seen seen actually walking through the streets and spraying stuff into the air, trying to spray surfaces with disinfectants and things like that. They needlessly bury bodies as well because they're afraid that somehow there's an epidemic associated with these bodies that could occur. And that's just a myth, and it's an earthquake myth. And actually, the bodies that die in an earthquake, they're actually less infectious than living people. It's kind of a strange thing to think about, but actually, living people have the organisms. They're coughing, they're sneezing. Those organisms are alive because the body's alive, and those bacteria and germs that cause diseases actually need a living body. And so bodies that are associated with earthquake-related deaths just don't spread disease like this, nor are there other causes of that as well. People may say, well, they lose water, or there are other things. And of course, we have a lot of those things that are risk factors in earthquakes, but we just don't see the epidemic. So please don't make this mistake of misappropriating the very limited amount of resources that we have in order to be able to try to make a difference as far as epidemics. Not going to be the case in the overwhelming majority of earthquakes. And when you do see these sort of diseases, it's not a big deal when we're talking about earthquakes. So let's talk about secondary disasters related to these earthquakes. What really does happen? If these epidemics don't, what are the other things that we should be worried about besides the earthquake? And one of them, as I've alluded to before, fires and other explosions as well, right? We have these areas that can catch fire. Once a fire spreads and so on, you can have secondary explosions, and people can survive the original earthquake but succumb to the fire. Or, for example, earthquakes can release dams, so you can have dam failures and floods, flash floods, as a result of that as well. And the Chinese in Sichuan province a few years back actually were very keen in recognizing that there was a dam that was damaged up in the higher elevations, higher than a town, and were able to fix that dam before it failed after the earthquake. They went and checked the dam, and very astute people were able to recognize that they needed to do something about that, and then they prevented this secondary disaster. So that was really a great move that the Chinese did with that particular move. The other thing that we can see too is the release of toxic or radioactive materials. We all lived through the Fukushima disaster, where the earthquake that occurred in Japan, and then that affected the nuclear power plant and the release of radioactive materials. This can happen also with industrial societies when we're talking about chemical releases and so on for things that are stored in that fault zone area. So a couple of different things we need to do about that. Number one, recognize that danger, certainly during and after the effects of the disaster, but also beforehand, thinking in terms of, how can we make these installations safer? How can we make these facilities to withstand these kind of seismic shaking that is commonly associated with these particular earthquake-related disasters? Now, the other secondary disaster that we all know about now, of course, after the tsunamis that have occurred, this idea that an earthquake can trigger a tsunami. And when it does so, then that we have a secondary disaster. In Indonesia, it was remarkable. A 9.0 is a big earthquake that shook a lot of buildings, damaged a lot of buildings. People came to the streets. Once they got to the streets, tsunami came in through the city as well. So, 15 minutes later, after the earthquake, after a tremendous bad disaster, now a tsunami comes in, which is even more horrendous. And then the other thing that these earthquakes cause are landslides. You see this in areas where earthquakes occur in areas that have hills. And so, for example, in Southern California and other areas around the world, in Iran and other areas as well, we see that, related to hills and mountain areas. And then we can see a little bit of shaking cause a slope failure. That means a large area of ground that actually moves down the hillside because it's shaken loose, and we have resultant landslides because of that. So that can occur as a result of these earthquake-related disasters as well. And I want to talk a little bit about human factors and kind of natural factors that can actually increase the health impact. In other words, that can worsen our ability to be able to sustain through an earthquake itself. So one of them, of course, we just alluded to, are the hazardous materials. Is it being stored near your where you live or in your city? Is your city at risk for earthquakes? And if so, does it have these installations of hazardous material close to a population that could become affected? We mentioned also about fires, and urban fires in particular, very severe in earthquakes. We We've talked about dams. All of these are human factors. And there are also structural factors as well. Do we build our buildings to withstand earthquakes? Do we build them in a way that can actually sustain through that and save the lives that are in it? And then there are other non-structural factors as well, just the way that we normally behave, how our society is established. Are we dependent upon highways? Are we dependent upon mass transportation? Are we dependent upon individual cars? Are we dependent upon electricity? Are we dependent upon other things? How our society works and how we normally function also makes a difference in our survivability through earthquakes. And now there are natural factors that also reduce the health impact of earthquake disasters. And one of them is just the fact that if there's no secondary disasters, then our exposure is reduced, of course. And then also, too, aftershocks can make a difference. So if there are heavy aftershocks after an earthquake, and of course, let me define aftershock. Aftershock is a small series of earthquakes that happen after the big one. So a big one happens, and then you'll feel small amounts of shaking. Sometimes these can be big, but often they're small. But with a little small amount of shaking when the building is already damaged and people may be in there trying to do rescue, a little bit of shaking on an unstable structure can then increase our risk. I also alluded to earlier about this local weather conditions. Is it raining? Is it cold? Is it hot? You know, when the body is wet and there's a little bit of cold, many of you have experienced this yourself. You're even colder, right? You lose a lot of body temperature because the water itself actually conducts heat better than air. So air can be a good insulator. It doesn't necessarily conduct heat very well or cold very well, absence of heat. But then when you're talking about being wet, now you can lose a lot of body heat. So if it's raining and a little cold, now you can have a much more dangerous phenomenon. In addition, also too, what time of day that this particular disaster occurs changes the way these injury patterns occur. So for example, if it happens during the daytime and a lot of people are out in these more dangerous buildings, maybe in multi-story buildings that are less safe than their particular home, which may be a wooden structure, not really a heavy structure, doesn't have a lot of brick or other type of masonry that are heavy things that can fall on them and so on. What time of day it occurs can actually also make a big difference. We also see a difference in actually the injury patterns for people. During the daytime when people are standing, we see more head injuries. During the nighttime, when people are lying down in bed and sleeping, we see more pelvis and chest injuries because, of course, things falling down, where are they more likely to hit? So I want to talk about these other human factors as well, and the idea that we can reduce our exposure. Once again, exposure is how close are you to the problem? How close are you to that particular hazard? So one of the things that we do to identify just where is that hazard is we do a thing that's called hazard mapping. And many of you may have seen this in the past, where you look at a map of a city or a state or a province or a nation, and you can see areas that are red and different colors and so on, yellow and green and so on. And these identify where the most shaking is expected to occur. Once again, it's related to these fault zones, but also the ground and the makeup of the soil and so on above that as well. So we can look at these areas where we live, where we play and work and so on, and identify the areas that are more dangerous than others. And, you know, city planners can look at those areas as well and identify, look, we don't want to put critical infrastructure in an area of the city that's going to move more than other areas. And it's certainly not all the same throughout the entire city. As we recall in the last earthquake in the Oakland area, you know, we had some areas that were landfill. And since that soil had been brought in down in certain areas, then that soil moved more than other areas that were up on the hilltops in that area. And so we know that certain areas being more dangerous than others, when we create these maps, we actually now can identify and plan our lives around that, plan our developmental decisions around that particular structure. We also want to look at the shelter and work in safer locations as well. So if we have a choice, you know, of course we can't disrupt our lives, and I'm not asking you to do this remarkably disruptive thing, but of course that's a decision that you make, right? But if you have the choice to be able to work in safe locations, live in safe locations, be able to think in terms of what's the most dangerous parts of the world, what are the most dangerous parts of my city, and so on, thinking and making those long-term decisions, those are just smart moves. Minimizing the proximity to the critical infrastructure as well. You know, if I live next to the factory that has a large number of chemicals, or a warehouse or storage facility that has a large number and it's right next to my neighborhood, of course I know that if there's an earthquake, that's going to be a bigger problem for me than if I was out in the middle of nowhere and no such proximity. So those are the kinds of decisions, once again, they're individual decisions. I want to empower you to be able to make those kinds of decisions or move towards that. I know it's all a matter of, trying to move the dial towards safety. We can't just flip a switch and everything turns safe, but I want to think in terms of how can we make some decisions in our life that'll lessen our risk overall, not only as an individual, but what kind of decisions is your city making? What kind of decisions are your state or your province or your nation making in regard to being safer over time? We don't want to make the lives of our children and our grandchildren more dangerous by making these decisions. We want to develop our communities, develop our infrastructure so it's safer as time goes by, and then that's when we win in the future. We can mitigate the damage to this public infrastructure. We can avoid these secondary technological disasters with safe buildings and good land use regulation. If you have an area that's very unstable, then we want to be able to have a regulation of land use in that area where we don't have those dangerous facilities or dangerous home settlements in areas where we know that we're just asking for trouble. So there are some other things that we can do as well to lessen the health impact of earthquake disasters. And actually, I like this one, this idea of reducing vulnerability. We talked about vulnerability as the susceptibility of a person to a particular disaster hazard. And we know that actually some people are more susceptible than others, right? We talked about this as, children under 5 or people over 65 or 70 years old. And, I push that number up there. The closer that I get to those numbers, I think, oh, you know what? 55 isn't so old. Maybe old is now 80 or something. And when I'm 80, oh, well, old's 120, right? But one of the things we want to talk about is that we have to recognize that different people are susceptible in different ways. And if they're susceptible in different ways, then we want to be able to make them less susceptible. But this is a win-win situation when we do so. If we promote health and we make people healthier, particularly children and the elderly, when people are healthier, they survive disasters better. So all the work that medicine and public health and all the type of cures that are coming across and healthy lifestyles and good choices in food and exercise and so on, healthy people survive disasters better. So it's a no regret option. Healthier people, we get all kinds of benefit from that. We also want to lessen people's dependence upon daily medication or therapies. If you need medication every day and that's disrupted, like insulin and other things, once again, if it's preventable, we want to be able to do so and be able to focus our efforts in these areas that are at high risk so that healthy people make healthy decisions. In addition, also, we really, in earthquakes, want to improve personal mobility. So we really want to encourage people to maintain that through life. Exercise, mobility into all ages of life as well, whether young or old and so on. Improving personal mobility makes people more apt to be able to take the appropriate shelter, take the appropriate steps to be able to evacuate these areas when they need to, and that just makes for good sense. And also, it just, of course, it complements your own lifestyle as well without an earthquake occurring. We also want to improve interpersonal communication with people. The more that people have a good social network, the more they communicate, the more the communities, the tightness and the cohesion of communities actually save people's lives in time of all disasters. And so that's really important for us to recognize and to, accept that and actually improve that and promote that, because that's what it's, even on a good day, no disaster whatsoever, that's a good thing. It really does make communities work and function better, but it's especially important when we're talking about communities that are at high risk for earthquake disasters, because that's a coping mechanism that people can then rely upon to save their own lives and save the lives of their own communities and neighbors as well. The other thing that we want to do is what I'm doing right here, right now with you. We want to improve public knowledge and awareness. And so I want you to help me. One of the things that I'm offering in this particular course is I don't want to just teach you. I want you to go out and be the disaster expert. I want you to share with your friends and your family. And also, if you want to join me in this expert, this expert role or expert space, I want you to be the expert that goes out and teaches people. Do lectures with this same type of awareness and knowledge that we can share with people so that they can protect their lives as well. The more people that know these tricks, the more people that know these measures and these safety rules that we want to follow with the earthquakes, the more people that we can save their lives long before the earthquake ever occurs. So the final thing that we want to do is build capacity. In addition to reducing exposures and reducing vulnerability, we want to build capacity. What does that mean? Well, capacity are the things and the resources that you have available to you in order to be resilient, in order to respond. So reducing the exposures and reducing the vulnerability, we really do that ahead of time. In building capacity, these are the kinds of tools and resources we use after the disaster is over or when it's occurring to save lives. And we have to think about building that capacity. And one of the most important capacities that people can hold, one of the most important resources is knowledge. Public education of earthquakes in particular in these earthquake areas. If you live in a city, 9 times out of 10, we can tell you whether or not you're going to have an earthquake in that area. It's on a seismic zone, it's location dependent. Folks in those areas should be teaching their children, teaching their families, teaching their communities how to respond and how to prepare for disasters. Education, key element. In addition, also, just simply socioeconomic status. We all want to have people that are resilient in a way that actually, all want to prosper. I want you to prosper. I want you to make more money, to have more freedom, to have more resilience in the future as well. But you know what that does as well? It actually saves your life. People with more economic resources, people with more social resources are more resilient. They have more things and more choices that they can make. They have more resources to put those choices into effect, and therefore this socioeconomic issue is big. So we have to think in terms of that as well. And it's a no-regret option, right? You don't regret the fact that you become, more prosperous in these periods of time as well. So thinking in terms of that in a bigger picture, and of course that's something we all strive for individually. But we should also be thinking that in terms of our community, making sure that everyone, as the tide rises, all the boats float, so to speak. We also improve access to health care and access to science as well, because people that have these kinds of access, better education, healthier people, once again, a better informed population. We also, in addition to these healthy people, we want healthy buildings. We want to promote structural and non-structural mitigation in buildings so that these buildings, schools, hospitals, and so on, they survive these types of events, and we have people not injured as a result of these building failures. And also I want to say as well, we talked about healthy people, we talked about healthy buildings. The other is healthy community. A healthy community has a safe hospital, it has safe schools, it has safe clinics that survive. We also have public services like water, sanitation, solid waste management, things that survive these types of insults as well. And also resilient public utilities and infrastructure, roads and other city services and national services that are built to last, built to be able to survive these things, not simply built for the 20-year investment that may be driven by some other type of indication.